And I heard the speech language pathologists and the radiologists talking, and they were saying words like penetration, aspiration, and I knew at that moment, because I'd observed swallow studies in my clinical career, that she was aspirating, and my heart just like sunk. Hi everyone, so for this episode, I am going to chat about my daughter's experience with laryngeal, cleft, and dysphagia. So this is a little bit of a long story, but I'll try not to make this episode too crazy long, but it does start when she was born, when she was an infant. So I have my notes here because I want to make sure that I don't miss any parts of her story. So my daughter is my first child, and when she was born, I discovered that with my babies, I have an overactive, letdown, and an oversupply. So what that means for me is that I make a lot of breast milk, more than my babies need, and my milk comes out fast when they start nursing. For my babies, this happened for my son too, but I obviously first discovered it with my first child, my daughter. That means a lot of coughing and like gagging and a little bit of choking at the breast. So the milk is coming out too fast for them to manage, and it just causes some struggles at the beginning. So if anyone out there has struggled with overactive letdown or oversupply, I feel ya. It's hard, and I think one of the hardest things about it is people hear like, oh, you have oversupply, that's so nice. But oversupply can be really challenging. With my son, for example, it caused him to almost be failure to thrive. So oversupply is not a walk in the park. While I'm thankful that I was able to supply enough milk for both my babies, it was not without its challenges. And like I said, one of the things we noticed first and foremost was that she was kind of coughing and gagging at the breast. And so I did talk to her pediatrician about it, and I brought up the idea of a swallow study, which I'll talk about a little bit more later in this episode. But we both kind of agreed that it wasn't necessary at that point, and hindsight is 2020. I kind of wish that we had gone through it, because it would have saved us a lot of just difficulty walking through her medical diagnosis. So because we were struggling a lot with breastfeeding at the beginning, I went to a breastfeeding support group at a local mom clinic. It was a free group on Fridays, and the lactation consultant, the IBCLC there, observed me breastfeeding my daughter and recommended that we get evaluated for a tongue tie and lip tie. And I had kind of heard about a tongue tie before, because I had a tongue tie I had a tongue tie revised when I was in the 4th grade. So I actually remember my tongue tie revision. I remember that I got to stay home and eat Jell-O all day and watch TV. So I knew a little bit about what that meant, but I didn't really know a ton about tongue ties in babies until I experienced it with my daughter and did a ton of research on that. And so we decided to find a pediatrician. We looked for a pediatrician specifically experienced in tongue tie and lip tie revision. We found a really great one in the Phoenix area. So if you need an idea of where to look in the Phoenix area, you can always send me a DM and I can tell you where we went, because our doctor was amazing. And so we went to see him, and he did confirm that she had both a tongue tie and a lip tie. And that is significant because that can contribute to coughing and gagging at the breast. So I thought, okay, our problems are solved. We're addressing my oversupply. We have some different positional changes for that. For example, you can do laid back breastfeeding to slow the flow of milk as it comes out. You can do block feeding to help reduce the oversupply at the breast. Now we're getting the tongue tie and the lip tie revised to help with the gagging as well. I'm going to do the exercises, and we're going to be all fine and dandy. So our breastfeeding relationship improved significantly. I did have some nipple pain that also improved a lot after the tongue tie and lip tie revision. And so I thought we were smooth sailing, and I was happy. We were both happy for a while. I did notice occasionally that when she was breathing, she would be like a little bit wheezy, but I didn't really think anything out of the ordinary, and neither did our pediatrician every time they listened to her lungs. However, the story does not end there. So she started daycare at around 5 months. My sister watched her from around 3 months when I went back to work. I went back to work around at 10 weeks actually. So my sister watched her from 10 weeks to 5 months. And then we put her in a formal daycare setting where she was exposed to lots of germs. And for anybody out there who has put their kids in daycare for the first time or school for the first time, you know that when that happens, they just get like the onslaught of illnesses just from like the new exposures that they're getting that they hadn't had before. So she started to get sick a lot, which we knew was going to happen, was very likely, but she was sick all the time. Like, I finally quantified the amount of times that she was sick, and over like a 3-month period, she had more than 8 upper respiratory infections or colds. My daughter had RSV, she had croup, and she's had croup several times, and she had multiple upper respiratory infections to the point where she was sick for like 5 to 7 days, and then she would have a 2 to 3 day healthy window, and then she would get sick again, and we would repeat that cycle, and we would never go more than 2 to 3 days being healthy before another cold came on. But every time I brought this up with my healthcare providers, they would just say, oh, you know, it's normal for kids to get sick a lot when they go to daycare. It's normal to have a lot of upper respiratory infections. It's normal to have a lot of bugs. It's just the daycare bugs. But finally, when I quantified it for my pediatrician, when I said, I know that it's normal to be sick a lot, but she's had this many illnesses in a certain period of time, she finally realized that we weren't just talking about the normal daycare bugs, that something was actually wrong, that we were getting sick a lot. In my head, I was worried about like an immune deficiency, and I don't really know. You can go to some bad places if you Google things. So we first decided to see a pulmonologist because of the wheezing and because of the consistent upper respiratory infections. Maybe we thought there was some sort of like lung issue. So she was diagnosed with tracheomalacia, which is when basically their airway is a teensy bit floppy. And this is a fairly common diagnosis in young kids, and they often outgrow it. But spoiler alert, my daughter does not and did not have tracheomalacia, so that was a misdiagnosis. And she was also diagnosed with asthma, which is now debatable based on what we know. We think she doesn't or did not have asthma, that her breathing issues were a result of the diagnosis that I will discuss shortly. So we were kind of working through that. We had several appointments with a pulmonologist. We had imaging done on her airway, and you know, they gave us inhalers, they gave us albuterol in the nebulizer, and they gave us all these breathing treatments, and she was still getting sick. It wasn't really resolving anything. The only thing that it did was kind of help her breathe a little bit better when she did get sick, but it didn't help with the underlying problem of the consistent upper respiratory infections. So on top of all of this, she was also getting a lot of ear infections, which is a blessing in disguise, because without these ear infections, we would never have gotten her other diagnosis. So because she had 3 ear infections in a short period of time, we were referred to a ear, nose, and throat doctor. And I decided to pursue seeing this ENT at our local children's hospital, which I'm so thankful that I did, because she is also amazing. If you're in the Phoenix area and you need an ENT recommendation, just send me a DM and I will send you her name as well. So we went to an ENT at the local children's hospital, and she recommended that we get a scope. So they're going to look in down her throat at her airway, when they are going to put in ear tubes. So we also got the recommendation to get ear tubes for her. So ear tubes are a surgical procedure. It's under general anesthesia, but it's an outpatient procedure, so you get it done and you go home the same day. And so she said, well, while your daughter is sedated, let's just check out her airway, because she's going to be sedated anyways, and we can see if anything else is going on, which I thought was a great idea, because I wanted to do things as minimally invasive as possible and not put her through a bunch of procedures. So we got the scope, and during that scope, or after that scope, is when we got her diagnosis of a laryngeal cleft. So a laryngeal cleft is when at the larynx, or like kind of like the voice box region at the top of your airway, there's a little notch. And that notch means that that seal on the top of your airway isn't fully closed because there's like a notch at the top that water and or food can slip through. So that means that they potentially are getting foreign objects or liquids into their airway. And that can be really dangerous. And that can also cause like swallowing issues. So if we see things penetrating into the airway, that's something called dysphagia, which basically means like incorrect swallowing. You're not swallowing things properly because when you swallow, it shouldn't go into your airway. It should go down your esophagus. So we got this diagnosis and her ENT told us this is possibly what's causing her upper respiratory infections, but we can't know for sure because some kids have a laryngeal cleft and aren't experiencing any dysphagia and aren't experiencing any swallowing difficulties. So she recommended that we get a swallow study. Now a swallow study is super cool. It's where you sit in front of an x-ray machine and you swallow something called barium fluid. And so barium doesn't allow any x-rays through it. It's an element that doesn't allow any x-rays to penetrate it. So when you put barium in front of an x-ray machine, it's completely white. It like blocks out any other things there. So you can see it really well. So for a swallow study, you swallow some barium liquid in front of an x-ray, a moving x-ray. It's like a video x-ray. And you can see it like going down your esophagus and then emptying out into your stomach, etc. However, when you have dysphagia in a swallow study, you can see that it goes the wrong way and it penetrates a little bit or a bit into the airway. And so this is a way that we can confirm if someone has dysphagia. And this is something that a speech language pathologist does. So if there's any speech language pathologist out there listening to this video or podcast, hopefully I'm not butchering this. It's a super interesting field and a super interesting procedure. So I'll link some of my favorite SLP resources in this video as well. So the doctor recommended a barium swallow study to test for dysphagia. Now, one thing that you should know about some of my professional experience is that I have worked with patients with dysphagia, and very often patients with dysphagia experience things like coughing at meal times or like wet breathing or significant choking. But sometimes patients with dysphagia can also experience something called silent aspiration, which means they're aspirating or the fluid is getting into their airway, but they're not showing any outward symptoms. So you could be experiencing dysphagia and aspiration and not even know it because you're not coughing at meal times and you're not showing any outward symptoms of getting anything into your airway. So I was convinced my daughter was not having any dysphagia because she wasn't coughing, she wasn't gagging, she was gaining weight great, she had no aversion to eating. So of course she could not have dysphagia because I would notice, right? I'm a dietitian. That's not right. I didn't notice. I am not a speech language pathologist, but anyways, it took me 3 months to schedule her swallow study because I was just convinced that she didn't have dysphagia. And so I walked into the appointment where we had the swallow study completely 100% convinced that my daughter was fine. And this was just a formality of us to figure out to like rule out something in her diagnostic journey. So I was sitting there in the room with like the big heavy like x-ray garment on and watching her get her swallow study. And I heard the speech language pathologists and the radiologist talking, and they were saying words like penetration, aspiration. And I knew at that moment, because I'd observed swallow studies in my clinical career, that she was aspirating. And my heart just like sunk because I knew it was coming. My experience with dysphagia in the hospital setting was of kids who struggle to take in their thickened liquids and ended up needing a feeding tube. That was predominantly my experience with that. Or seeing what thickened liquids look like in the kitchen. So during my master's degree, I worked in the kitchen of a hospital, and it was where a lot of older adults ended up getting procedures done who were also on thickened liquids. And so I would thicken sodas and coffees. The reason that you have to thicken liquids when someone has dysphagia is because if a liquid is thick, like as thick as honey, it doesn't slip as easily through little like notches or through muscles that aren't tightening properly into the airway. So patients who are experiencing aspiration or dysphagia with drinking regular water might be able to drink a liquid that's thicker, like the thickness of honey, for example, and it not slip into their airway. So for these patients, they have to mix this powder or this gel into all of their liquids and drink this liquid that is like the consistency of honey, or even in some patients the consistency of pudding, which means they would have to like be spoon-fed their liquids. And so because of this, because it's obviously really hard to drink liquids when they're the thickness of honey, especially for young kids, that's why a lot of my experience with thickened liquids in the clinical setting was with kids needing feeding tubes. So my mind immediately went there, and we went into the little consultation room, and I was talking to the speech language pathologist, and she said, your daughter is aspirating, which means she's getting fluid into her lungs, and she's going to need honey thickened liquids, which means I have to use a powder like this powder, and it's just this white fine powder. We used Thick, and mix it into all her liquids to make it as thick as honey. So I'm gonna get you a bottle of honey. Okay, so I know you know what honey looks like, obviously, and if you're listening to the podcast, I'm showing you a bottle of honey here, but I just want to like do this to drive the point home. I had to mix all of my daughter's water with this white powder until it was as thick as honey, and I wasn't allowed to give her regular water. So that's what I learned in that room with the speech language pathologist, and it was devastating. I thought I was going to have to learn how to put a feeding tube in my daughter. I was worried about her hydration status, especially because we live in Arizona where it's really hot and she needs to drink a lot of water, and she does drink a lot of water. I was worried about just that we would be struggling a lot. I was worried about daycare and how we were gonna handle that and thickened liquids to daycare, and it was just really hard. It was really hard navigating that. And so to any parents out there who are going through, dysphagia or thickening liquids or laryngeal cleft, I feel that was really challenging. But the way I respond to stress with my kids and medical situations is going into crazy overdrive researcher mode. And I spent hours on PubMed finding articles. I spent hours on insurance trying to get the thickener that I wanted covered at the amount that I wanted, because I didn't want her to be limited with the amount of fluids that she could drink because we didn't have enough thickener. Thick is expensive. It's like $25 a can, and these cans don't last that long, especially if you have to have thick liquids like honey or pudding. And I remember that our home health company couldn't get us our first cans for like a week, and I was on the phone with insurance and telling them, you're telling me that my daughter is getting fluid into her airways, into her lungs every time she swallows, and you want her to be like that for another week before you can get me the medication that she needs, the medical food that she needs. And that just blew my mind, because while we could afford to buy thickener for a week on Amazon, which we did have to do, it was so frustrating to me to think about families who couldn't do that, and that they would just basically be left high and dry by insurance to figure out what to do for an entire week while their child aspirated fluid into their lungs. So we did wait 2 days for Amazon Prime shipping to get the thickener to us, but that was mostly because we knew she had been aspirating her entire life, and she was then at that point 15 months old. Her ear tube and scope procedure was when she was a year old, and then 15 months was when we got the diagnosis. So we figured, 2 more days wouldn't make a difference. But from a clinical perspective, if you know your child is aspirating, you should absolutely do something about it immediately. So that was where I felt a little conflicted. We had to start thickening all her liquids. I was still breastfeeding her only at morning and at night at this point. And obviously breast milk is not thickened, and you can't thicken it unless you pump. And I hated pumping, and I still hate pumping. So I was kind of left with the choice of, do I breastfeed knowing she's possibly aspirating the fluid Do I pump and thicken it, or do I wean her? And we weren't given any support from the speech language pathologist about how to navigate continuing breastfeeding. She just encouraged us to stop breastfeeding. And at that point, I was kind of ready to stop anyways, because she was so wiggly at the breast. She would only last for like 2 minutes before she would pop off and want to play with something. She just had FOMO and was not entertained by breastfeeding anymore. So I decided to wean. That was a little bit difficult because I would have liked to wean completely on my own terms, but we were mostly ready anyway. So I honestly wasn't too sad about weaning her at that point. So 15 months old, thickened everything with honey thick, or with this pure thick powder to honey thick consistency, stopped breastfeeding. Now we had to figure out how to navigate daycare. So my daughter went to daycare full time, but now with a child who's on honey thickened liquids, we can't just send a water cup to daycare and they refill it, because she has to have thickened water. So I ended up having to mix her water in a blender every single morning and send extra to school just in case she would be extra thirsty that day. I had to mix milk in the blender every single morning so she would have milk to drink. And we had to review the menu with daycare on a weekly basis, because even though that her liquids were then thickened that I sent with her, she also couldn't have certain foods. So anything that's like super juicy that would cause a lot of free fluid in the foods, like clementine oranges are super juicy. Watermelon is super juicy. Kids who have dysphagia cannot have those because they risk getting that fluid into their lungs. So we had to go over and make sure there was none of those juicy foods on the menu. Things like soup she couldn't have, and we had to come up with alternatives for that. And so that was really challenging. Honestly, our daycare was amazing and they made it pretty easy. I think the biggest challenge of thickening her liquids once we got into the swing of things was that we could never just like give her some water from a water fountain or from the sink. Like if we went out to dinner, I couldn't just pour her some water into her cup. I had to bring thickened water in a cooler for her at the table. One time I even went to my best friend's house to have a play date with the girls, and I forgot water. And normally, if you're at your friend's house playing with your kids, you could just fill up their water bottle at their fridge or at their tap or wherever. But I had to call my husband, and he had to drive over to us, which was like a 20-minute drive, and bring us her water because we couldn't just get it from the tap. And that was really hard. Like, I feel like I will never take advantage of just being able to get my kids some water from the sink or from the fridge or from the water fountain ever again, because it's such a blessing to be able to do that and not have to thicken it. So now that she's not on thickened liquids anymore, I definitely really appreciate that. So what else? I'm checking my notes to make sure that I'm not missing anything here. We did go to feeding therapy with a speech language pathologist. It wasn't super helpful because my daughter wasn't displaying any outward signs and symptoms of aspiration. So the only thing she told us to do was to use a smaller straw cup. So we switched from a metal cup with a thick like smoothie straw to take and toss cups which had small thin straws, which helped her to slow the pace that she was drinking and helped to practice those swallowing muscles. However, now that we're thickening her liquids, we have to figure out what to do about her cleft, because the thickened liquids doesn't resolve the cleft. It just prevents the aspiration or fluids getting into her lungs. So we could do nothing. We could get a surgical procedure where they inject something to plump up the cleft and hopefully close it up, or we could get a procedure where they sew it up with stitches. And we opted for the injection procedure, which we did get done, and the procedure went well, and we got a swallow study again 6 weeks after that injection procedure, and she failed her swallow study. So we were kind of back at square one. The procedure didn't work and we were trying to decide what to do. So we then decided to get the more invasive procedure. So New Year's night, we got her in for her procedure where they closed the laryngeal cleft with stitches. And so this was an operation on my 2-year-old, on her airway, which was very scary, but she did great, and she was up and eating and drinking very quickly after the procedure. She recovered really well. And then 6 weeks later, we were like so excited. We knew that we had gone, you know, the most aggressive approach with revising her cleft, and we were convinced that everything was going to be fine. And she got her swallow study and she failed again. And so at this point, I was totally at a loss and obviously really frustrated, because we've been doing thickened liquids. We had 2 surgical procedures to address this problem, and she still can't swallow regular water or regular thickness liquids without getting fluid in her airway, which obviously is very dangerous moving forward, because, you know, children can get aspiration pneumonia, and I mean, you just don't want to get foreign bodies or foreign liquids into a child's airway. And so I didn't know what to do. And at this point, we were now kind of working on experimental options. And it was equally confusing for me as well as her ENT, because the majority of kids who have a laryngeal cleft, one, typically have other comorbidities. So they're struggling with other complex medical conditions. And two, the majority of kids who have laryngeal clefts who do not respond to treatment, especially, typically present with other comorbidities or complex medical conditions, which my daughter has neither. She is developmentally appropriate in every way and neurotypical. And it was just confusing to have this unique medical condition without any other things going on. And it just wasn't consistent with what we found in the literature, which of course I was diving into a lot. So our options now were to keep her on thickeners until she's a lot older, like 5 years old, and reevaluate. Our options are to wean her anyways, to try feeding therapy, or to try a nerve stimulation with tiny shocks and electrodes on the outside of her neck to help her coordinate her swallowing muscles. So we opted to try for weaning anyways. And so our rationale was that she doesn't know how to swallow, her muscles don't know how to swallow, and so she's had no practice with thin liquids like water. And so when she goes for a swallow study, of course she's failing the swallow study because she doesn't know how to do it. But with my daughter, she hadn't been given the opportunity to swallow any thin liquids, which rightfully so, because she was getting them into her airway, but we had to figure out a approach. So working with her speech language pathologist in feeding therapy, we decided to do an extremely slow wean off of her thickened liquids. So we did about a 12-ish% wean every 2 weeks. So what this looked like is I would put several scoops of this thickened liquid into a huge blender and blend it up. And we would slowly decrease the amount of scoops we were putting in our big blender every 2 weeks. So again, like I said, it was about a 12% wean. So as you can imagine, that took us a long time. That was about a 20-week process, which we cut out a couple weeks at the end, because by the time you're having 1 scoop and like 30 ounces of water, it's basically nothing. But that, if you think about 20 weeks, it's almost half the year. So we were looking at like a 4 to 5 month weaning process with my daughter. But we just decided to go for it. And so with the blessing of our ENT, who was also on board with our plan, and working with our speech language pathologist, we decided to try a slow wean. So our plan was to wean slowly off the thickened liquids, to continue seeing our speech language pathologist in feeding therapy, just for evaluation to see if there's any questions. And if this didn't work, if she started to get her symptoms back, we would try the nerve stimulation, which is a very experimental treatment. It's not really even known that it's effective for these kiddos with dysphagia and silent aspiration who needing thickened liquids. But I was willing to try it at that point, honestly, if that meant trying that over keeping her on thickened liquids for another 3 years before we would do something else. So our plan was to do all of that and then to come back to our ENT if she was experiencing symptoms. If she wasn't experiencing symptoms, meaning she wasn't wheezy, she wasn't getting sick a lot, she wasn't coughing or gagging or having any wet breathing sounds, then we would consider it a success. We didn't initially opt for a repeat swallow study because our ENT actually asked us a really great question. She said, well, if she does well and has no symptoms and she fails the swallow study, are you going to change your course of action? And our answer to that was no, because we wanted to work with my daughter's care providers on treating her symptoms, not like the definition of what she had on paper. And so we just decided to evaluate, like, if she's doing great and there's no signs and symptoms that anything is awry like she had before, if that's all resolved, then we would consider it a success. So we weaned off the thickened liquids over the many months that we did it, and her symptoms did not come back. So we were like thrilled. I just cannot even describe to you how amazing it felt to fill up her water bottle from the fridge and just give it to her. It was so wonderful to put that blender away. I did keep this last can of thickener because I just feel like it's good to show on social media when I talk about this, but yeah, she did great. We did eventually get a swallow study later on because she started to have difficulty swallowing certain foods at meal times. And we were concerned that she then was developing eosinophilic esophagitis, which is a condition that my husband has, and I will record a video all about that later. And so we suspected that. And so that is something that a swallow study can shed light on if there's swallowing difficulties that often comes with EOE. So we got a swallow study because we were concerned about that, and she passed with flying colors, which she also does not have EOE. We got evaluated for that anyways. But because of that little EOE scare, we got the swallow study and she passed. She was not aspirating. She wasn't getting any fluid in her lungs. So the procedure worked and the slow wean worked. And my daughter is no longer on thickened liquids after over a year being on them. She can drink regular water. She doesn't have any food restrictions. And it's amazing. So that's her story with a laryngeal cleft. It's a type 1, which means it's the most shallow laryngeal cleft. I was afraid that my son would have a laryngeal cleft as well because it is a birth defect, but he has not led us to believe that he has any issues with a laryngeal cleft. So we don't believe he has that. And he has had some like evaluations for other like swallowing ENT stuff because we attract medical issues in my family. But I said that was going to be a short video and it obviously wasn't. And I keep saying that and I need to stop saying that. But that's our experience with tongue tie, oversupply, overactive letdown, but mostly dysphagia and laryngeal cleft with my daughter. She is now 3.5 years old. She is doing fabulous. So if you're listening to this or watching this because your child has a laryngeal cleft or there's a laryngeal cleft scare, know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it is possible for your child to recover and have a cleft revision if needed and to do well with liquids for the rest of their life. So I will link two scientific articles in the caption that I relied heavily on for data about the laryngeal cleft as both a mom and now a provider. Well, I was a provider at that point, but a provider who is knowledgeable about the nutritional needs of a child with a laryngeal cleft, which mostly is just ensuring adequate hydration and limiting any juicy foods. So I'll link those in the caption below, but please send me a DM if you have any questions about our experience, or if you just want to reach out to somebody who's going through something similar to you. Let me know if you like these sort of episodes where I chat through my experience with something that happened in my family, because we have a lot of things going on that I'm going to make other videos about. Make sure to subscribe and follow along on my Instagram at growing.intuitive.eaters. I've also got the podcast and the YouTube and the TikTok. So check me out there too, but I will see you on the next episode.